So instead of doing the entire lecture in today's class, I decided it was best to kind of break this into two pieces simply because my voice would not last through both sections. So I hope you don't mind that this first section is going to be recorded. So the part that I'm going to be recording is dealing with birds' bills, feet, digestive tract, and a little bit about feeding behaviors. We're going to talk about the different groups of birds in the lecture in class for September 10th. But this is the first part of the lecture from September 10th. So birds have large energy needs because they spend energy at a rate much faster than other animals, in part due to the fact of their flight. And when birds are in flight, they're not always stopping for food. As a matter of fact, there are some that can fly for what seems like, if not actually is, days on end without stopping for food. So because they spend energy at a significant rate, they're also going to need to eat a lot of food. So they're going to need to feed frequently, or when they do feed, if they're feeding for migrations, they're going to need to eat a lot. And it appears that much of the anatomical structure of birds is actually related to finding food, getting food, and then processing the food. In order to do that, they've made a lot of adaptations. When we look at them, we see that their bill has been changed from the way we think of a jaw. It is much lighter. It has no teeth. So therefore, how they feed will be slightly different because they don't have the option of chewing the way that we do. Their feet are going to need to do a lot of these services to provide them with food because since their bodies are adapted for flight, they don't have hands. So the feet and the bill are going to have to do what our hands and mouth do. They don't have that luxury, if you will, of feeding with utensils or picking items up with their hands. Their wings don't work that way. Their digestive tract is going to be modified as well, in part because they have no way of crushing their food with their bill, so there needs to be a way to crush the pieces of food as they travel through the digestive tract. And then there are feeding behaviors. The majority of the feeding behaviors revolve around one, if not two things. The first being getting food, and the second being not being somebody else's food. So you want to find your own prey items without in turn becoming prey for someone else. When you're looking at birds outside, start thinking about how they forage. Are they actively hunting? Do they wait and see food and then pounce? What types of foraging behaviors are they using? How do they eat, or how do they swallow? Can you see that with the birds? How do they lap up water? Is it different from the way you would expect from other animals? And what are they eating? Sometimes the methods through which they eat and catch their prey can actually help you identify the species as well. So why are we discussing all of these things together? Because they seem like they might not go together. The feet, the bills, and the digestive tract, but actually these three pieces are part of the digestive system of the birds. When we talk about human digestive systems, we start with the mouth and the teeth and the tongue, but birds don't have the teeth. And the bills can do a lot, but the feet are necessary to bring the food to them. And in fact, the feet may do some of the first processing of the food by ripping seeds apart, by holding things still. So much the way that we use utensils to eat, birds can use their feet. They also use their feet to catch prey, so they will also act as weapons for hunting. So these three sections of their body do work together. Some birds concentrate their ability of catching prey with only their feet. Others are done by the beak or the bill. This is because those forearms are completely dedicated to flight. Having said that, there are a few birds that do seem to use their wings to either help avoid being prey, and on a couple occasions to help capture their prey, or at least kind of corral their prey into a given area. So many of the functions of feeding are going to be done with the feet and with the bill being the way that the food actually enters the body. And the digestive tract is going to accomplish much of the work that's done by the teeth in other animals, but also that is done by our digestive tracts. So chemical digestion of food, absorption of food, that's all going to happen within the digestive tract. The beak, the tongue, the stomach, and the intestinal differences are all going to vary along with the dietary specializations of the bird. So different ones will have different species specializations. And with some of the ones that are very different, we will look at those a little bit more in depth, whereas others we probably won't touch much upon their digestive tract systems. So the feet. First thing to keep in mind with feet is that the knees are not actually backwards. What looks like a backward knee to us is in fact the ankle joint. The knee is much closer up to the body. And in a lot of bird species, the knee may not be easily seen because it may be so close to the body that it is covered by feathers when you are just looking at the bird. And birds do not walk on their feet like we do. Birds instead walk on their toes. So they're going to be walking more of a digitigrade motion, with the toes being the things that are in contact with the ground surface as opposed to the whole foot. As I mentioned, the knees are close to the body. The feet, what we see as the bird foot, is actually mainly the extensions of the toe bones, and not the way that we think of our foot or a cat's foot or a dog's foot. But their joints are very similar to human joints and to a lot of the mammalian and reptile joints. The difference becomes that their joints are not always where we would expect them to be, whereas you can draw a lot of correlations between reptilian, turtle, and mammal joints. The bird joints look a little bit different or are in a slightly different placing. And this is probably really blurry on your screen. I apologize for that. This is showing you a little bit about the bird leg. So you see the pelvic assembly, so which would include things like the pelvic bones and the hips, and then the very short femur. Whereas in humans and a lot of mammals, the femur is the long bone. In birds, it's actually the fused tibio-tarsus that is going to be the long bone, whereas the knee is very close to the body, making the femur short. One mammal I can think off the top of my head that has a similar structure would be the kangaroo, having a shorter femur and a much longer tibia usually. The ankle is much higher up on the body than you would expect, based on a mammalian analogy of their foot assembly. And then the tarsus, which would be the fused bones of what would be between our ankle and our toe joints. And then the toes there, which the toes being entirely on the ground, the tarsus connecting up to the ankle, up to the tibiotarsus, to the knee, and then up to the femur. So birds use their feet for a lot of things. The first obvious one is locomotion. Whether this is running, walking, or hopping, birds use their feet in order to move from one place to another. Some are very adept at this, such as roadrunners, and some are fairly clumsy, such as the loons and the grebes. They also use their feet for clinging. You've seen this a little bit with woodpeckers and nuthatches. They also use them for climbing, and the woodpeckers and the nuthatches are a great example of that again. They carry things. Food items is an obvious thing they carry. They may also carry material that they're going to use for nesting. They use their feet to perch, whether this is on a tree branch, a telephone wire, or right next to their nest while they're taking care of their young. Having the ability to kind of stand still and hold onto areas where you're standing is important. A lot of birds, when they're perching, will be far above the ground surface, or at least slightly above the ground surface. So they need to have feet that are very strong to hold that perch. They also use their feet in some species for killing their prey. Some birds use their beaks, others will use their feet in order to kill. They may use their feet for preening, so cleaning their feathers, combing their feathers, getting everything back, removing parasites from their feathers, like mites or ticks. They hold their food, especially necessary if your food is a little squirmy when you're trying to eat it, like a fish or a worm. You might need to hold it down with the foot and then bend over with your beak to grab a hold of it in order to eat. Our penguins, as we mentioned before, cradle their eggs on their feet. Some birds will use their feet in aerial courtship. As a matter of fact, it's almost like they're holding hands as they're flying, but in fact, they're holding feet. Additionally, in some species, when you see them holding feet when they're flying, it's actually an act of aggression, and they may actually end up tumbling through the air as they are trying to figure out who is the winner of that argument, fight, or the mate who may be waiting there watching, going, oh, which one is going to be the best at fencing with their feet in the middle of the air. We saw the ducks and a couple other waterfowl out at Hines. They use their feet for swimming. There are birds that will do a lot of diving, and then the feet are used for steering as they're underwater. A lot of birds, as they're making a water landing, will use their feet as brakes on the surface of the water to help them land smoothly. And this is just a start of the different types of uses that birds have for their feet, but it extends considerably from here. With the feet, the toes have generally speaking one of three different arrangement styles. The first style is the anisodactyl, with 3 toes facing forward and 1 in the back. That one that's facing backward is called a hallux. This is the hind toe. Think of this as being similar to our big toes. This is what we find in most birds. Not all, but most. The next is the zygodactyl. This is 2 toes facing forward and 2 toes facing backwards. Toe 1 and toe 4 are in the back. This is seen in the owls, the cuckoos, the woodpeckers, and the parrots. The birds in this grouping may spend a lot of time climbing or perching on vertical surfaces. And having the 2 toes forward and the 2 toes backward helps to distribute the body weight and give them a very good hold onto the item that they're trying to grip on. And then the third option is a heterodactyl. This is 2 forward and 2 backward, but it's toes 1 and 2 that are shifted backwards. This is only seen in the trogons group. It's Trogon. And here you can see those 3 different types of toe arrangements. There's some additional toe developments that are also worth mentioning. These are things that if you look closely at birds' feet or at the next picture showing them, you'll be able to see them. The first is the palmitations. This is what you're used to thinking as the webbing between the toes of birds. So this is what we see in the ducks. This is what we see in geese. Another is lobes. Lobes are kind of like extra extensions of skin or flesh over the toe bones, but not fully connecting between each toe. So similar to webbing, except that the toes themselves are not connected. Both lobes and palmitations are very important in swimming, so you see them in a lot of water birds, but also for walking on loose surfaces. Because unlike toes that are singular, having this extra area of contact with the ground, either through the lobe or through the webbing, is going to allow the bird to be much more stable. Ospreys have a scale that is on the bottom of their foot. They use that to grab feet. And then you have the great blue heron, who has a serrated talon that is used for preening the feathers. That is one of the toe modifications. And here we can see the palmitations in the duck foot, and then the lobed foot for the coot, the ostrich, which has the modified toes to have only 2, and 1 incredibly large toe, but this gives the ostrich a very large surface contact, allowing for good running. The pheasant with the highly scaled feet and the slightly larger toes than normal, allowing it to walk well through forested vegetation and unstable surfaces. The ptarmigan with the furry, almost, feet. Not fur, once again, feathers, but then you have the heron, the woodpecker, the eagle, and the warbler. The heron is a wading bird. It needs to walk through mud well, so having webbing will be difficult for it. So it actually works much better with the skinnier toes. The woodpecker has the toes spread like this and this toe arrangement to allow it to grip well into trees. The eagle has that talon structure for grabbing food, and then the warbler who must perch on areas. So its feet are going to be well created or well designed in order to allow it to grip on to small tree branches and other types of perches. The bills of the birds also have modifications. The first is that they have a bony interior with this outer plate of keratin, and that outer plate of keratin is called their amphotheca. This structure allows them to have what's called a horny beak as opposed to teeth. So it has this thick horn-like covering over top of it, allowing it to be strong, allowing it to be used for killing prey, slicing through prey, and still not making it heavy. So they're contrasting usability with weight. It is reinforced by internal bony struts. These internal bony struts are called tuberculae. This is what allows the bill to have its structure. So it's the bony interior with this keratin over top. There is some flexibility with the beak, which is important. And this allows for dexterity, allows them to pick up seeds, allows them to pick up other things, but it still has enough protection so that if they pick up a sharp seed, it is not going to stab through the beak. The connection between their upper jaw and their skull is jointed, and in some birds, this joint allows for great movement of the skull. When we talk about this, we're going to be talking about skull kinesis. There are some birds that have flexible joints as parts of their bill that allow for even larger flexibility with the mouth structures. And their birds are really highly modified, not only for food, but for other purposes. For food, things like cutting and crushing seeds, catching and holding fish. Some birds, like woodpeckers, will probe into tree crevices, and then you have sandpipers who are going to probe into the mud to find food. Some birds need to chisel wood, whether it's to get to their food items or to build a nest. It may depend on the season or what exactly they're doing at that time of day. They need to stab prey sometimes, and others are going to sieve their prey out of the water. So they're going to work like a sieve would in order to kind of filter the prey material, the solid material, out of the water. They may filter water directly with their beaks. They may need to tear into flesh if they are a meat eater. Some of them will transport food using their beaks, either to another location that is safer for them to eat, to an area where they will store the food for later, or perhaps to their chicks. They can use their beaks to straighten feathers. The doves and the pigeons actually have the ability they make a substance that we'll talk about at some point called crop milk, where it is a milky-like substance that they secrete within their digestive tract, and their young have to be able to stick their bills into the parents' crop area of the digestive tract in order to get this crop milk. So they need to have great flexibility for that. Some birds use their bills to gather nesting materials or to fight with rivals over an area. And we'll see that bills are going to vary greatly in shape and color with both age and sex. Sometimes the color of a bill will actually tell you the difference between two species. We saw this with the egrets when I asked you if they had the yellow or the black bills and the black legs. This is showing you a different way to kind of look at the overall picture of the bird and not just look at the feathers as the only defining factor. Then there are some specific bill adaptations we're going to mention and we're going to look at on the next slide. One is the doe-witchers. Doe-witchers were going to fall in a similar group to your sandpipers and your plovers. They have a very thin, long bill that they put into the mud, and they actually have the ability that when it's in there to only open the very tip of the bill, so not open the entire bill. This allows them to grab something in a very small crevice where they can create a larger cavity at the bottom of it. Then you have all of your shorebirds that probe beneath the soil surface. Their bills have these little tactile sensors, so they have touch sensors on their bills that are going to sense little clams, little crabs, other organisms moving underneath the soil, and they're going to know which way to go to find that animal, or, well, yes, animal, insect, prey. And then they will go in, they'll put a little hole with their beak, open it up, and then close the beak and grab the food item. Finches have very powerful and thick bills. They need to crack seeds and they need to remove the seed husks when they're feeding. Having a powerful bill is necessary if you're going to do this, especially in the years like we have now, where the seeds may be very dry. Nectar feeders, like your hummingbirds, they have a bill that frequently reflects the shape of the flowers that they feed from. This is important because their bill needs to fit into the center of the flower in order to gather the nectar. Sorry. Then we have raptors. Some of our raptors have large hooked bills, and they use this for tearing off hunks of flesh. So what might these bills look like? Here we have the doe witcher, a finch, a hummingbird, and an osprey. Very different bills, all suited for exactly this lifestyle that they have and the type of food that they need to eat. So do bills change or do they stay the same from season to season and year to year? The bill's shape needs to be matched to the food that they're eating, otherwise it doesn't work. If a finch beak was put onto a doe witcher, the doe witcher would not be able to probe for food like it needs to. If a hummingbird had a raptor's beak, well, that would be really problematic because it definitely couldn't eat nectar. So the bill does need to match the food. But what happens if your diet changes seasonally? And many birds do, especially a lot of our songbirds changing from insects in the breeding season and during the season in which they're feeding their young to seeds, berries, and vegetable matter only in the winter. Then your bill may need to change a bit, but generally speaking, it needs to be capable of handling all of the dietary extremes. There may be slight shifts, or it could be that some birds with different beaks, bill shapes are going to be better adapted for different times of the year, or even in the long run, it can lead to speciation. We do know, looking at the finches, that one of the things that drives speciation was the drought on certain islands in the Galapagos versus others that had a lot of rain. On the islands that were drier, that had different seeds, the seeds were tougher and harder, and the birds with larger beaks and beaks that were thicker had a much better chance of getting into the seeds and living, and therefore reproducing. So we see that bill size can actually change from generation to generation because of what birds survive depending upon drought years or wet years, and in long term this can lead to speciation. Songbirds' bills have to be very kind of flexible within their dietary extremes, but it may also be that these insects that they eat may have similar traits to the berries or seeds that they also eat, allowing them to have the same bill in order to eat a variety of food items. Now, beaks are not the only thing that we're going to be looking at. There's also tongues that matter for some of these birds, because for some of them the tongue may be more important for feeding than the beak and bill structures. The birds that eat insects, we call insectivorous birds. Generally speaking, if they eat a lot of insects, they're going to have a short, thin, pointed bill. Think about why. These are going to be things like woodpeckers or nuthatches. Well, nuthatches will eat some insects. Creepers, brown creepers. If they're eating insects from crevices of wood, they need to have a bill that's going to fit well into those crevices. So it would need to be short, and would need to be thin and pointed, especially if it's going to need to be doing any of the excavating to get to the insects. Having a pointed bill then becomes almost necessary. Some of our birds that are considered aerial sweepers. These are things like the nighthawks and the nightjars. These are birds that are going to fly at night, generally speaking, if you're talking about the nighthawks and the nightjars. And they're going to fly almost with their mouths open as they're feeding and moving through the air, because what they're going to do is they're going to take big gulps of air as they're flying into swarms of insects. And as they do this, they're going to be grabbing all of the insects they can get inside of that mouthful. To do that well, you need a very large mouth opening. So these birds have a wide gape. You also do not want a beak that is very heavy or one that is very hard. You want some flexibility to it. So their beaks tend to be short and relatively weak compared to other birds. And insects do not fight back effectively for the majority. So having a weak bill is not a problem for the food items that they're feeding on. If you are a carnivorous bird, so if you're eating meat, you want to have a beak that may be able to kill prey, or at least be able to tear off pieces of the prey that you're eating. So they tend to have heavily pointed beaks. Within the carnivorous, we see that the hawks, the owls, and the eagles are actually going to kill with the talons, and then the beak is used to tear off chunks of food for consumption. Whereas the falcons dive at their prey, and this diving motion may stun the prey or even knock them out, but then they use a bite on the neck to kill them and like break the spinal cord. The fish-eating birds are going to use the strongly hooked tip of the beak to help seize fish. They may also use their feet in order to grab them. We see this with osprey, and that sharp tip on the osprey's beak works incredibly well for fish, which tend to be their prey item of choice. Darters and anhingas have a bill that's almost harpoon-like because they also eat fish. But unlike the osprey, who hunt from the air, they're going to hunt while in water. So you want a bill that is shaped like a harpoon, or like a sharp, thin, long knife, in order to allow you to grab the prey the moment you see it. Spoonbills have a very flat bill with a broad tip. I have a picture in a couple slides for you of what it looks like. That long bill that is flat actually allows them to create a water current. So they stir up the water, and this helps to lift their prey from the bottom of the water column, so what's hanging out on the sediment, up into the water column and allowing them to filter feed that out of the water or grab it out of the water. Many of our aquatic birds do have a filtering apparatus that they use to move water in through the mouth and then take the water back out and keep the food items. In the dabbling ducks, we mentioned this last time, it's the lamellae structure. Whereas the flamingos, this is kind of interesting. I do have a video of this at some point for us later. Their jaw, or their bill that is sharply bent. And the upper portion of the bill, it says jaw, but it should say bill, they actually vibrate as they have a mouth full of water, as their mouth is in the water. But their lower jaw remains motionless. So that top jaw is providing the current, while the lower jaw is staying in a stable position, and this allows them to filter that way. So they're creating the motion they need to filter. And this shows you some of the variety we have in beaks for birds. The warbler, the nighthawk, the hornbill, the raven, eagle, pelican, so many different ones here. And each bill is shown, each bird that's shown shows you the name as well as how it hunts. And for a moment, look at the crossbill. So named because its bill actually crosses over, and it feeds on pine seeds out of a pine cone. So having a bill that actually crosses like that with the bottom tip one direction and the top the other is going to allow it to feed very efficiently. And this is that spoonbill that I mentioned we would be coming back to. So the spoonbill is going to use that beak to stir up the water, and then it will allow it to attack its food much, much better. So some of our seed-eating birds are highly specialized, like this crossbill shown here. If you're a seed-eating bird, generally speaking, you're not going to eat the husk or the outer portions of the seed. You only want to eat the inner portions, so your beak must first of all be able to remove the husk. There are a lot of ways this can be done. Some birds will be able to slide it off. Some will hammer at it and then eat out the good parts, like you see with an acorn, where they would drill a hole into it and then eat the portion from inside of the acorn. Some of them will hold the seed still and slice the husk off. Others will crack the husk using pressure. And then you have the crossbills. These two tips of the beak that overlap in different directions actually allow them to pry the scales of the pine cone apart, and then they use their tongue, which is a prehensile tongue, to get the seed out. So their tongue has a lot of musculature behind it, and it can move incredibly well in order to get the seed out of the scale once it's pried it open using the bill. That prehensile tongue we also see in birds like woodpeckers and in hummingbirds, but they act slightly differently in those groups. The woodpeckers, the nuthatches, and the chickadees will wedge nuts or seeds or acorns into a hole in a tree, and they hammer it until they can crack it open, and then they can eat from the inside. And other birds, once they've cracked it open, will use their tongue to remove the seeds. Others will swallow it whole. Some will keep pecking at it to make it small enough so that they can swallow the pieces. But a lot of times the seed-eating bird's first priority is to get the seed free from the husk so that it can become edible. So I mentioned this idea of kinesis of the skull or kinesis of the jaw. This allows that upper jaw area or the upper beak to flex upward while the lower section expands laterally and sometimes even downward. So this is creating a much larger opening of the mouth for the bird than it would otherwise have. And this is because of how the jaw is hinged. In fact, this allows birds to swallow things that are actually larger than what it appears that their mouth opening is. When might this matter? Well, let's say you need to, as the blue jay might be doing in this picture, crack open a seed. You're going to need to make a lot of pressure, so you're going to need a large opening in order to do that, especially if the seed you want is tiny and the husk is very large. Or what if you're one of these shorebirds here and you need to get to food that is in the mud or in the sand? I don't know how many of you have ever tried this, but I imagine if you've been to a beach ever, you've tried this. What if you're digging in wet sand or digging in wet mud? As you're digging a hole, doesn't it fill back in? So you need a way to hold it open. What they're going to do is they actually put their beak down in and then open the beak inside of the hole. So this allows them to create a large hole and then use their tongue or suction in order to feed from the item that is in that hole. So having this kinesis or this motion of the jaw that allows for extra opening is incredibly important for these birds, and it's what allows them to be so effective at feeding even without front limbs that are useful for feeding. So because of that loss of the front limb for eating, the jaw movements and the beak movements have to take over some of what needs to be done in order to get the food into the body. And with that, I should have mentioned, also some birds carry really large food items at times. And having the ability to carry a large food item is very important. But here we see in picture A, the skull kinesis and how it allows for a very wide gape or a wide kind of opening across the front of the mouth. So you can see here the white arrows that are inside of the mouth showing you that wide gaping area. So that gape we would refer to would be the internal kind of diameter of the mouth opening. And then in B, this is the doe witcher that it's showing you, the idea that it can open just the tip of its beak, but a long, thin beak is going to be able to easily go into the mud or into the sand. And then as it opens, it's actually going to be creating pressure against that, allowing them to have an area in which to eat in the mud and the sand that would otherwise immediately fill back in. But while the beak and the tongue work incredibly well for getting food, processing food can become kind of problematic. If your tongue's main focus is having tactile sensors or high specialization, it works for finding food, but not necessarily well for processing food. So some tongues do have these tactile sensors that allow them to identify, is this food or is this a grain of sand? Is this a little bit of mud or is it a piece of algae? And in some birds, many of the tactile sensors aren't necessarily for outside of the mouth, but inside as you're trying to swallow the food item. If you are a bird and you are trying to swallow a live fish, for instance, you want to know if it's trying to escape from your mouth. You want to know, is it facing the correct direction for swallowing? Do I have it tail first, head first? What? Is it sideways? And sometimes you need to have these sensors in order to get food in the right direction to crush it. If there's only one direction of force that crushing a seed works for, you need to make sure that the seed is that direction when you go to crush it, otherwise you could injure yourself. So these tactile sensors are remarkably important. Additionally, the tongues are sometimes highly specialized. The northern shoveler, which is a duck species, has fringing on the tongue that it uses to kind of filter its food from the water. So instead of relying on lamellae, it may use these fringe structures on the tongue. Woodpeckers, their tongues are long and they're barbed, so they have these small extensions all over the outsides of them. This allows them to investigate holes in wood really well, and they can then find food using their tactile sensing on the tongue, whereas the barbs they can use to impale the insects and other prey items they find and bring them out. And woodpeckers, along with these modifications, also have very sticky saliva. This helps them to not only impale the insect, but also to stick it to their tongue, allowing the insect to not escape as they withdraw their tongue from the wood crevice. And then your nectar eaters, such as your hummingbirds, have very long tongues, and the tongues actually have these hair-like projections that are coming off of them that allow the nectar to adhere to them. And then it's going to suck up the nectar kind of like a straw would. But its tongue is what allows it to capture the food. So once again, whereas with us, the tongue is used for processing to help with chewing of the food, these tongues are used for finding food and getting food correctly into what would be their equivalent of the alimentary canal or the digestive system. So here we are looking at the hyoid bones. These are similar structures that are found in woodpeckers, hummingbirds, and some other birds with incredibly large tongues and long tongues. The hyoid bones, though, in woodpeckers are interesting because this is what helps the woodpecker from not getting a headache, in part, while it is pecking at wood. But the hyoid bones are elongated, and it's almost kind of, it's curved in nature, not quite circular. And they're going to go from basically the throat up towards the eyes, or the top of the beak. So this is the structure through which the tongue is going to project as it comes out. So the tongue can be stored back in the structure, can also be pulled forward as needed. In the picture of the bird on the side here, you're seeing that extended tongue outside of the woodpecker's mouth. So when we talk about these tongues being highly extensible, in both woodpeckers and hummingbirds, they clearly are. And in picture C, you can see the barb-like structures that would be on the tongue of the woodpecker that would allow it to grasp the food items and stick to the food items. If it helps you, you can think of these as kind of like little projections like villi inside the small intestine. It would be better to think of them like that as opposed to like taste buds, because these are structures in them of themselves and they do serve a very important purpose. So when we look at birds' digestive tracts, we will see that the digestive tract length and complexity may depend entirely upon the bird's diet. Their digestive system is remarkably efficient, and it is incredibly difficult, very different from what we see in other vertebrate species. So do not think of this in terms of very similar to mammals or reptiles. Instead, you'll discover that there are structures here that we don't have and structures that we have that they do not have. The birds that eat fruit, meat, and insects tend to have relatively short digestive tracts. And birds that eat seeds and plant matter separate from the fruit, things like grasses, and in birds that eat fish, they tend to have relatively long digestive tracts. The digestive tract length in part is going to be due to the difference between the fact that they have no teeth. So the gastric apparatus, the different parts of the digestive tract, are going to do all of the food processing. And their digestive systems work very quickly. This is because they need to provide energy rapidly, and food is heavy inside of the gut. All of you know this from having had a really good Thanksgiving dinner at some point in time. When you've eaten a lot of food, your stomach just feels really heavy and you don't really want to move. Now for birds whose entire life may depend on needing to fly from point A to point B if there's a predator nearby, Having heavy food sitting in the system is not evolutionarily an advantage. So they're going to process food quickly, and that means that they may not process their food as well as other animals. So they may need to eat more food because of this. So they're always going to be minimizing the time that the food stays in the body. Berries are processed in as little as 30 minutes. And there are some ducks that process shellfish, or at least invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, in less than 45 minutes. Imagine from the time the food enters your mouth until it leaves your body, 30 to 45 minutes. This is incredibly fast food processing. Yes, this is why when there are geese, there is poop everywhere. They process very quickly, especially grass, which contains almost no nutrients. So they eat a lot, and in turn, they defecate a lot. So the esophagus in birds is very simply a narrow tube. Its job is to move the food from the mouth to the crop. In some birds, it will be a little bit more important, especially if they're feeding their young, but a lot of times it's just a tube for food transport. It can stretch considerably, which is important in birds that carry a lot of food within their digestive tract. The crop, though, is what is really used for temporary food storage. It is used for transporting food to the nestlings, and in the doves and the pigeons, it's the area where crop milk is produced. Hence, it's called crop milk. It's made in the crop, and it is a white, milky-looking substance, so it was named crop milk. Within the crop, there is some digestive ability. The food is softened, and this also works similar to the sphincter at the end of the stomach. It's going to regulate the flow of food into the rest of the digestive tract. The Hoatzin does foregut fermentation in its esophagus. 80% of this bird's diet is green leaves. Within the esophagus, it actually has a lot of bacteria and protozoa that are going to break down the leaves so that vegetation can be processed and they can get as many nutrients out of them as absolutely possible. Moving then on to the next system, a part of the digestive tract the food would come into, is the stomach. The stomach form and its structure is going to be related to the dietary habits of the birds. The carnivores and the piscivores, those birds that are eating fish, are going to need storage that is fairly large and can accommodate large stores of soft food. These birds may not get to eat constantly or even all of the time. So when they do eat, they're going to kind of gorge themselves on food. Also, they're the predators. They don't necessarily need to move from point A to point B very quickly. So their stomach is going to be a lot larger than perhaps the birds who are going to eat seeds all day long. Seeds and insect eaters, though, are going to need a very muscular stomach because they're going to need to do mechanical breakdown of a relatively hard food source. So within the stomach, we have a couple of sections to look at. One is the proventriculus. This is where you're going to see the initial breakdown of the food. So this is like the beginning of the stomach. It's between the crop and the gizzard, and there's a lot of digestive enzymes there. So if you want, you can think of this as doing similar jobs to our stomach. Sometimes it's very small in birds, and in a few it only looks like an enlargement of the esophagus and the crop area, not as an actual separate section. And in the picture on the slide, you can see that the proventriculus just looks very similar to the esophagus. It's kind of like a tube for food movement. The gizzard is a little different. This performs the same functions that our molars perform and that our teeth perform. In birds that eat seeds, the gizzard is highly developed. It's incredibly necessary. The gizzard is where the food is ground up and it is pulverized. This chamber is highly muscular, and it's lined with keratin and also sandy grit and sometimes pebbles. In some birds, they're actually going to consume sand or gravel or small pebbles in order to keep these hard pieces inside of their gizzard. So if you see a bird eating small pebbles or sand, don't really get too concerned. That may actually be part of what it needs to do in order to do digestion of its food source. So this is pulverizing the hard food substances, breaking apart the bones of the fish, breaking apart the seed pieces. For an owl, this is an incredibly important area because it may eat things whole, and if it does, as well as a mouse whole, there's a lot of bones there. They need to be broken down, somewhat at least, so they can be disposed of properly. And that brings us next to the intestine and the ceca sections. So the small intestine, like ours, is the primary site of chemical digestion. The enzymes from the pancreas and the intestines are here breaking down the food items. This is where we're going to see the absorption of the nutrients, once again, so much like our own small intestine. We do see that birds that eat a lot of plant matter have a much longer small intestine than those that do not eat plant matter. This is because it takes a long time to absorb all of those nutrients from the plant matter, which is relatively weak in nutrient concentration. So it needs to have a long small intestine in order to get all of the nutrients possible out of the plant matter. In birds that change from plant matter to insect matter, you may discover that that length of the small intestine varies slightly with seasons. The large intestine is relatively short. They may have this as modification because the passage of food needs to be so quick through the system, and this allows them in order to move that very quickly through by having that small and short large intestine. The ceca is found at the junction of the small and the large intestine. It's relatively small in carnivores, incredibly large in herbivores because it contains symbiotic microorganisms that help with the fermentation of the plant matter. So that last effort at digesting plant matter to get as much out of it as they can. The seasonal changes in the diet are going to be reflected by small changes in the tract. As I mentioned, if you switch from insects to plant matter, the intestine is going to change a bit in length in different sections to assist with that. But we do know the passage of food for carnivores and fruit-eating species can be anywhere from minutes to hours. But in these herbivores that are eating a lot of plant matter, it may take days. Unless you've made the changes that a few species of herbivores have. Things that eat a lot of grass. They could spend days going through that and getting as much nutrient out, or you could just eat a lot. So if you eat a lot, you don't have to exert as much energy to get the nutrients out of every last drop because there's a large food source. So there is a trade-off there between how often you eat, how much you eat, and how well you process the food that you have. The total gut length of an organism can change with its food source and is directly related to the lifestyle it has, or if you want, the lifestyle that a bird has directly influences the length of its digestive tract. It can be one of those which came first, the chicken or the egg questions. And then our next item is elimination of their food. There's a couple things that we can talk about with elimination. And obviously here, we're talking about waste. And when you're thinking of the coagula, this is an area that's going to store waste while water is being reabsorbed. I know that says what water, but that should say while water is being reabsorbed. So the coagula, think of it as a similar structure to kind of like our kidneys, grabbing on to extra water so that what is passed from the body is not water rich, because you don't want to be dehydrated. Uric acid in birds is actually going to be precipitated as urates. This is going to be the white part of bird poop. So that white part of poop on your windshield, like you can see in the picture here, is the urates. The dark matter is fecal matter that is voided. So this is all going to kind of come out together. And when you see fecal matter that doesn't have white but has a lot of purple or blue or even green in color, that is reflecting the vegetation or the berries or the other types of food they have been eating. If you're in an area where a lot of the bird poop is purple, it's because the birds are eating berries. For geese, their poop is frequently green and white because of the grass and the white urates. There are some birds that have salt glands, and this may help them in regulating salt or excreting salt and keeping their hydration levels together. And then one thing that is not in here about the digestive system that is important to mention is the idea of pellets. We'll be getting to this when we dissect owl pellets, but owls, when they're getting rid of the bones of the food they've eaten, as well as some other birds, will actually, instead of defecating it, they're actually going to throw up a pellet. And in owls, the pellet is all of the compacted feather and fur and bones and everything else from their prey items that they cannot continue passing through the system. So it comes through the quakelet is going to have to be small. It's not going to be feathers and skulls of the mice that you've eaten, because that passing through would actually be really difficult. So pellets are going to be produced kind of within the gizzard and the stomach area, and then they're going to be sent back out through the mouth. So that's going to help clean the digestive system in kind of two ways there. And then we have some additional kind of feeding information. One is the idea that birds can use tools for feeding. You can find videos of green herons and crows using tiny pieces of bread or of another kind of food item and kind of putting them out on the water and then waiting. Both crows and green herons have been found to use bread and other matter as bait to go feeding and to go fishing. So they're going to wait for something to come up and grab that food, and then they're going to grab it. So they are very effective fishing birds. Crows will also use tools to get food. They will make tools of their own. They will keep tools that they like. We'll talk more about this when we talk about crows themselves and about bird intelligence. But birds have the ability of using things in order to make their feeding better and easier. Birds do prefer familiar food. Young are going to have to learn from the adults what is good and what is bad to eat, or if you will, what is good and what is poisonous to eat. And a bird, given the choice between familiar food and a new food, will almost always choose familiar food. This not only helps in setting up the identity of the flock of birds by the food they go after, but it helps keep the birds safe. We've also discovered that the foraging skills improve with practice, or at least improve with age. The birds that forage more are going to get better at it, whether it is catching a live prey item or figuring out how to correctly crack into a nut or a seed the first time. Foraging skills get better with both age and practice. Birds need to eat a lot, in part because they typically do not have much in the way of fat reserves. The only time birds have much in the way of fat reserves is when they're going to migrate. And then the fat reserve is necessary because they may be flying all day or all night or all 24 hours of a day-night time period in order to get from point A to point B. And having a fat reserve when you're migrating is important, but at other times of the year it's not necessary, and it would actually get in the way of their flight. So they need to be able to get food regularly. Meat eaters are known to set aside food for later. When we talk about shrikes, we'll talk about the larders that they make, which is sometimes the idea of finding a really large grasshopper and kind of putting him on a chain link fence and coming back to eat him later. Turkey vultures, it might be dragging a carcass to a different location, or telling the other turkey vultures nearby, hey guys, I just found a fresh deer. And kind of obvious by now, birds that need to eat on a regular basis, or they may starve to death. And this is because they have very high energy demands and because they process their food really quickly. When you process food quickly and you have a high energy demand, you need a constant supply of food. And we'll talk about why we'll talk about this as we talk more about our birds, because many of the behaviors of birds are going to be related to finding food, because finding food is the driving force behind what they need in order to survive. So I will do the bird families in person, but I just figured for saving my voice, it was much easier to record this for you all now and then kind of post it for you to watch later. Also, this does allow you to sleep in a little bit more. All right, thanks so much. Let me know if you have any questions.